question has to do with how soon are our genes affected, and does that determine our destiny? Well, our genes are affected from our mother and father from the moment of conception. The thoughts, the feelings, and the emotions of both parents from hours to days to months before conception have an imprinting effect on the sperm and the egg that will then become the fetus. So if your mother and father are quarreling all the time and they're angry and they're lustful and they have hatred, they're basically activating chemicals of survival, and more than likely that child will be born of the flesh. In other words, the genetics that that child will begin to express reflect a code of what their parents are embracing in the environment, so the child is more prepared for the same environment when it's born. That's why in Native American cultures, in African cultures, in traditional cultures where before conception the mother and father were separated, they fasted, they thought about bringing a new child into the world intentionally, they thought about consummating their love and expressing it, which of course by the same means, if those two people come together and they contribute genes in a state of love, in a state of giving, in a state of caring, in a state of intention and conscious, to contribute to the species, to contribute to the whole, then that child more than likely will be born of the Spirit, will be born expressing a greater mind, and that they will be prepared to enter an environment that their parents have been interpreting that they more probably not be brought into. So then once the sperm and the egg come together, then the genetic die begins to be cast. In other words, what our parents have been emotionally embracing becomes the first sequential genetic expression. And then because the mother and fetus are in constant communication, that the blood supply from the mother and its hormones are in constant communication with the developing fetus, the thoughts, feelings, and actions, what the mother says and what she does, is in direct correlation or in direct communication with the fetal blood flow. So now, as the fetus then is developing and the mother again is in an environment of stress or an environment of survival or an environment of poverty, then you're going to see the fetus begin to develop further to reflect the environment that he's about ready to enter into, because that's what the mother is perceiving. So then smaller head circumference, smaller forebrain, bigger hindbrain, the fetus begins to modify itself genetically even further. And so again, you have other variables like you have nutrition and malnutrition, and you have chemical exposures. But aside from that, then at the moment of birth, transition, now when the developing child now is expressing its genetics that it's gotten from its parents, if the parents now begin to have a change of heart, and they begin to say, okay, we were angry and hateful and lustful and aggressive, but now we want to raise our kid in a loving and nurturing environment. Even though the genetics are in place for that developing child because of its exposure, it still has the ability to change from a changing environment. So we can nurture the child then in a loving environment to begin to make synaptic and mindful changes, which will then help the child live a better life. By the same means, if the child is then brought into the world, and now through its environment, instead of its genetics, its environment now is still reflecting aggression and hatred and lust and anger, then now the genetics will be further cued, because both the environment and the genes are in the circle. So when it's kind of ironic that we're raised by the same people with the same genetics, which then means we're going to probably imitate and model their actions and behaviors, which now we have nature and nurture, environment and genes working together. So what what I'm saying is that we come pre-wired based on what our parents thought, felt, and how they acted. And it starts before conception. If it's done in survival, if it's all about me, if it's all about how I can feel pleasure, how I can win, how I can be the best, or whatever it is, then the child is going to be born attached to that primitive emotional state. But it's not. But it's not the end, because as the emotions begin to continue in utero, it has a further influence. At the time of birth, there's still opportunity for changes to take place, and if the environment is such that the child can begin to have more direct contact and more loving and nurturing environment, things can change for the better. So we're either born in survival or we're born in a state of creation. And that selfless act, and the selfless act of creation, the side effect of that is a child who's more prepared for an expanding and growing and changing environment where learning and love and more elevated states of mind are reflected in the genes.